Hey guys, before we begin, I'd like to announce that I will be showcasing and live illustrating in Boston this January 24th for the Raw Artist Showcase event. Come see some epic live performances and engage in the craft of other talented artists. Tickets are sold in the link below, and I hope to see you there. Ben 10 began as a show about a young boy on a road trip with his family that gains 10 superpowers and fights common criminals and the occasional alien threat, and evolved into a colossal mess with enough time travel in alternative dimensions to compete with Doctor Who on one of the hardest sci-fi shows to keep track of. This video will break down every dimension, universe, and timeline shown in the original Ben 10 franchise. But first, what's the difference between these three categories? I'm Kuro the Artist, and I'm glad you asked. A dimension is a natural existence that has an immeasurable property of space. It itself is not technically physical, but can contain all forms of matter, energy, and properties that it takes to build a universe. A dimension can exist without a universe in it, which is usually presented as a white void. Inside, a universe can be created, and multiple universes can exist within the same dimension.
Wait, I thought the universe was everything.
A common error of the parochial mind. There's always more to reality than one imagines.
Universes are usually created by the Quantumalia, extra-dimensional beings that travel through the multiverse to make universes for fun? However, there are known exceptions, such as the Null Void, which was created by the Galvan after discovering how to breach into uninhabited dimensions. This dimension was utilized to contain prisoners, but eventually the prisoners colonized and their descendants created a small economy. The Forge of Creation is also a dimension that exists outside of the realm known as the Omniverse, and it is nearly inaccessible unless you're either a god or have a god key, dramatically titled the Map of Infinity. This is the place where the Celestial Sapiens are born. There are also pocket dimensions. It's not really known if a pocket dimension is capable of holding a universe within, but they seem to be used as pit stops for all the extra-dimensional beings traveling between dimensions. They are also disconnected from the Omniverse as well, and are unaffected by multiversal plus occurrences. Some other notable dimensions are Dagon's world, which is wherever this squid demon comes from. Dagon, being extra-dimensional himself, was able to hop between realms and start converting them into his worship. One of these realms is Ledger Domain, also known as the realm of magic, where mages like Charmcaster and Hex are from. There's also the place where Paradox built the Perplexohedron to contain a piece of the Map of Infinity, which is a giant death trap inspired by the horror film series Cube. There are many others, such as Rex's Dimension, Dimension 12, and wherever this is, but there's not much to say other than there are other places that exist. Multiple universes exist in the same dimension, they become a multiverse. Usually, due to their proximity, natural events of the universes play out very similarly, with minor differences between each other. These universes become parallel universes to each other. Even though they share some common denominators, these universes exist completely independently from each other, and their own events are isolated and do not affect one another. Obviously, we have Ben Prime's universe, but let's go over some of the alternative possibilities. Our first alternate universe shows a version of Ben Prime getting sent back in time to where he first got the Omnitrix. While this Ben is pretty much indistinguishable from the Ben that we know, this isn't our Ben. This Ben remembers everything that's going to happen in the future, yet similar to Flashpoint, Ben's time travel somehow changed the natural course of events. This time, Gwen got the Omnitrix, and Vilgax does not get damaged and turned into a cyborg, and instead heads straight to Earth a mere days after Gwen finds the Omnitrix. Ben was able to use his future knowledge to cheat his way around everyone having to figure out what's going on, but does not ever receive the Omnitrix by the end of his story, and it is unknown if he ever returned to his normal time period. Our second alternate universe is often mistaken for an alternate timeline, but as these events happen without any form of quantum manipulation and are never brought up in any way by Ben Prime, this is better classified as a completely separate universe. In this universe, Ben's identity is revealed to the world at the end of Summer Vacation, where he defeats Vilgax with the aid of his father, Gwen, and Grandpa. It's assumed that this universe can eventually lead up to the original Ben 10,000, and could very well be the original timeline that was forced out of the main continuity due to Gwendolyn's actions. But again, there's no evidence to prove that this reality exists through some sort of time debacle, and is best just left alone as an alternate universe. This universe is where Alex Winter's live-action films take place. They both share similar traits to what happens in the main continuity, but there are subtle differences that force them apart. This universe is where we are first introduced to Eon, and the main trio's counterparts from this world make a small cameo appearance in the episode Ben 10,000 Returns. This universe also shows a lot of key elements that come into play during Ultimate Alien, like Ben's car, the hybrid transformation nanomech, the Swarm Queen, and, of course, Eon. While these films are very different in tone, they are in fact the same universe, as actor Lee Majors was even set to return to the role of Grandpa Max, but ended up not being able to commit. This is a universe where Ben didn't have to destroy the Omnitrix to defeat Vilgax, therefore he kept the same device his whole life. This was mentioned by Paradox when describing the different universe and timelines to the gang and Ultimate Ben. While this does sound very similar to what would happen if the classic series timeline were to continue all the way through, or also match up with the Goodbye and Good Riddance universe, there is no evidence to suggest that they are, in fact, the same world. And the fact that Paradox is using this as an example to alternate paths highly suggests that this universe is not tied to Ben Prime either. In this very same scene, Paradox also mentions a world where Albedo unlocks Alien X, but cannot successfully use him and was trapped motionless for nearly a year. This is actually a reference to the video game Ben 10 Vilgax Attacks, where this happened as a post-credits scene for the DS version. It's a very obscure yet satisfying continuity nod, which this show is notorious for. This universe people call the 23rd dimension. I don't know why it's called a dimension, and I don't know where the number 23 comes from, as it's pretty much one of the only universes with a number in it, but whatever. But this is also where the infamous Ben 23 is native to, where it's not hero time, it's beaver fever. This is the dimension where Grandpa Max dies and his parents are still garbage at being parents, I guess, so he turns into what any adolescent Twitch streamer would do if they had superpowers: turn his heroics into a giant marketing ploy and get it all on video. Every adventure he spends with Ben Prime, meaning yes, he does come back multiple times, he does travel a little further down the hero's past. He's also mysteriously unlocked aliens that Ben Prime didn't even have at that age, and ones he got under extremely specific circumstances, like Nanomech and Frankenstrike. I can understand the latter, but Nanomech was an artificial creation of the Omnitrix, and shouldn't already have dormant DNA inside waiting to be unlocked, but hey, that's not what this video is about. There's a universe where Ben is evil, there's a universe where Ben is evil and also Australian, a universe where Ben is a zombie, a universe where Ben sat by himself at the lunch table, and a universe where the Omnitrix never existed and is another average unsatisfied millennial. There's also another Gwen 10 universe, which isn't much different from the first, except this Gwen gets to participate in the upcoming multiversal battle, and the other loses her Omnitrix to Max. Lastly, the post-Ben universe. I've talked about this a lot in my other videos, but basically Ben Prime's universe got destroyed and he used Alien X to make a new one. This one's meant to replace his original universe, but has minor differences from the original. We've covered how dimensions can be split off into alternative universes, but let's go a step further. A timeline is the natural progression of a universe from start to finish. Every universe begins with one timeline. While universes function independently from one another, an alternative timeline cannot exist unless it is created by changing pre-established events, creating a new outcome, remarkably, through time travel. An alternative timeline usually rewrites the original, changing how the universe continues to unfold, but previous timelines can be revisited through extra-dimensional means. These timelines all inevitably trace back to the same universe. One universe's timeline cannot affect another through typical time travel means, meaning, if something were to change in Universe A, Universe B will remain the same. I will only be going over the timelines that derive from Ben Prime, but trust me, there's quite a lot. From the very first episode of Ben 10, we are introduced to two different timelines. The events of the first timeline, Timeline A, are unknown. Presumably, either Max would obtain the Omnitrix as Xylene's original intention, or Ben would end up finding the Omnitrix some other way. As revealed in the Omniverse episode And Then There Was Ben, Vilgax succeeded in destroying the multiverse in a future we will discuss later, leaving only one alternate Ben to survive. This Ben is taken back in time by Professor Paradox to help reset Ben Prime's timeline by using the Omnitrix to put things into motion, creating Timeline B. This timeline will be the actual timeline that the audience follows for the majority of the classic series, where we shift focus to the primary antagonist, known as Ben Prime. This is the Ben we typically stick with all the way until the end of Omniverse, and is known to be the most capable among his alternate counterparts. The series would continue normally all the way up to Ben becoming Ben 10,000. However, this Ben became misguided, narcissistic, and vastly more antisocial. This prompted Gwendolyn to go back in time to Ben Prime's youth to give his future counterpart a self-evaluation based on living comparison. While this trip to the future doesn't change things immediately, Gwen's interference ends up creating a new timeline, Timeline C. In this timeline, Ben Prime does not grow up to be the future that we saw. We do get to explore this future a little bit more in what I can only classify as a bonus episode, known as Ken 10. But this is no longer Ben's true future. However, Ben Prime still retains the memories of his visit, which are brought up in episodes like War of the Worlds Part 1 and Ben 10,000 Returns. This timeline continues into the film's Secret of the Omnitrix and Destroy All Aliens. This Ben is also the one hurled into the future in the episode The Forge of Creation, but this event does not create a new timeline. Instead, this Ben is brought back in time by Professor Paradox and vaguely recalls these events as a dream. Skipping ahead to Alien Force, Ben and Gwen are now 15 and pal around with Kevin instead of Grandpa Max. In their earlier adventures, they first encounter Paradox, who is trying to contain a creature that ages everything it touches. Failing to stop it leads to a future where the entire world is destroyed. Luckily, the gang is able to prevent this from happening, creating Timeline D. This timeline continues a few more episodes until the Incursion Invasion, where a misfire causes a large dam to cave, putting everyone at risk of drowning. Ben uses Alien X to rewind time before the dam explodes, creating Timeline E, and the team apprehend 7-7. Further down the line, Gwen gets the idea to go back in time and stop Kevin from mutating when he and Ben try hacking the Omnitrix to stop Vilgax. She disregards a warning from Paradox and goes back in time to that night, bringing her past self aside to convince her to stop Ben and Kevin, creating Timeline F. She succeeds, but this leads to a future where Hex and Charmcaster were able to conquer the entire Earth, because preventing Kevin's mutation stopped him from obtaining the necessary abilities to counter their plans. Realizing her mistake, Gwen goes back in time again to create Timeline G, and wipes her original past self's memory. I found it interesting as this is one of the rare times where a time traveler's alterations do not immediately get reset, so they have to take special precautions to ensure the timeline plays out correctly. That is also why this reset is classified as a new timeline, rather than reverting everything back to Timeline E. We now reach an episode that becomes one of the most referred to episodes when discussing time travel in alternate dimensions, which is Ben 10,000 Returns. Here, Ben meets his future self for a second time, but still retains the memory of the original one, and points out that they don't match. This is where it gets established that every time Ben meets his future self, his future will change, meaning that after this episode, Ultimate Ben is no longer his true future either, splitting Ben Prime off yet again into Timeline H. Things play out normally for a while after that, until Eon shows up again and swaps the minds of Ben Prime with his younger self through time, temporarily creating Timeline I, which only exists in this loop. After the Bens and Gwens work together to defeat Eon, the Bens merge the timelines back together using clockwork, and Timeline I disappears, reverting everything back to Timeline H. Now, this is a very subtle one, but it still technically counts. When Paradox gave Ben's future son Kenny a special device, he starts to travel to the past to aid his father on certain adventures. In his first appearance, he simply takes down a single enemy before hastily disappearing, but this still counts as an alteration to the timeline, and now creates Timeline J. To protect his identity, Kenny starts going by the name Spanner every time he's in the past. In the future, Dr. Animo gets the idea to go back in time and aid his younger self with whatever. And to stop him, Spanner goes back with him. We are unaware that Spanner is supposed to be a time traveler at this point, but even so, future Animo gives it away, and their meddling creates Timeline K. And yeah, since it's Animo, things get cleaned up with no consequence. Now we're at one of the most shocking episodes of the whole franchise, where Vilgax gathers together an army of evil Ben Tennysons from across the multiverse. It's interesting to note a line uttered by Vilgax.
For over a decade, that whelp has prevented me from arming a legion of Omnitrix-clad minions to conquer the universe.
Ben's first encounter with Vilgax is at age 10, and currently, Ben is 16. While only 6 years have passed for Ben, at least 10 or more have happened for Vilgax. This is because Vilgax has spent the last few years time traveling with Eon to multiple universes, trying to recruit every Ben Tennyson he could.
Eon has merely been helping me collect Ben Tennysons from all throughout the multiverse.
It was a long process assembling Ben Tennysons, but we had plenty of time.
So at some point between seasons 3 and 5 of Omniverse, Vilgax has splintered off from the timeline. Now he is much older than when Ben last encountered him months ago. This may explain how Vilgax was able to encounter Ben at age 11 with the squid monsters, despite being thrown into space a year earlier and noticeably absent for a whole 5 years. These time travel interferences from Vilgax may create a new timeline for every affected period, but since we don't know how much time travel Vilgax has done or where he went, we'll just say that all of his aberrations end result in Timeline L. Anyway, after a big battle between a bunch of alternate Ben Tennysons and Gwen, the Chronobomb activates, destroying every single universe except for one, the one where the Omnitrix never existed. This Ben received Ben Prime's own device seconds before his death, and is now aging outside of his own timeline, as well as Vilgax. This Ben works with Paradox to reboot the timeline and restore the multiverse, and was the very Ben that interacted with Timeline A and created the first alternate timeline that we see. When he returns, Timeline L is once again restored. From this point forward, we're going to be dealing with much more complicated time travel. So for the sake of keeping it simple, I'm going to skip over the details of what everyone's motivation for time traveling is and just point out the instance. If you want to know more, well, go watch the show. So Maltruant begins his quest collecting all of the body parts through time and space and sends Subdora and Exoskull into a museum, creating Timeline M. Spanner is there again too, and he lets it slip he's from the future. Subdora and Exoskull escape, and Spanner returns to the future. A few weeks later, Rook and Ben catch them stealing a Time Beast egg with Eon's aid. Eon rapidly ages one into a Time Beast, and Ben selects feedback to contain the monster. Things do not go as planned, and a spectating Ben 10K suggests Paradox to go back, creating Timeline N. Now, Ben 10K and Paradox aid Ben Prime and Rook, and Ben uses Gravitak to try to contain the Time Beast. Meanwhile, Ben 10K creates the Time Cycles. Gravitak accidentally creates a black hole that will eventually destroy everything, so Paradox resets everything once more into Timeline O. Now, there are 2 Bens, 2 Rooks, and along with Ben 10K and Paradox, they use the Time Cycles to de-age the Time Beast. Ben 10K creates a second set of Time Cycles for the remnant Ben and Rook to return to their timeline that they're from, and eventually they merge back into Ben and Rook Prime. Since the black hole was prevented, this creates Timeline R. Timeline R is our final timeline. There are more time travel shenanigans that happen after this episode, but those events are contained in a time loop and have already happened in the previous timelines. Nothing was changed, so nothing new was created. But if you'd like to know what happened, these events are covered in the final 2 episodes of Ben 10 Omniverse where George Washington fights Vilgax. You can also check out 5 years later to see some more alternate universes and whatnot at kurothewebsite.com. Let me know if I missed anything in the official Ink Tank Discord, and donate to our Patreon to support future projects like this. You can stay up to date with all of our projects on my social medias, and as always, keep it fizzy.